Well, good evening again, and welcome to this, the fourth of our series of technical webinars. The webinars are part of the reporting process of a 13-month leader-funded and NRW-funded project to look at results-based approaches to supporting the sustainable management of common land. Just to repeat for people who weren't here in previous meetings, the project was inspired really by the Welsh Government's stated intention in its consultation document, Brexit in Our Land, that it intends to replace both Basic Payment Scheme and Glasssteer with a new single measure, the Sustainable Farming Scheme, and that would reward farmers for the delivery of public goods, and to do so in a results-based fashion. So to cut a long story short, we applied for funding to do some thinking in that regard when it came to common land, because we know that that's a complicated question. And the project is now in its last month. So we've already had a stakeholders meeting and 3 of these webinars at which we looked at public goods themselves, at payment calculations, and at how to score a common. And so this is the last one. I'll just share my screen with you. Okay. Welcome, and let's get started. As we've been saying in each of these seminars, the logic that we had for having the project is still valid, and has been validated just in the last couple of weeks by Welsh Government in its forward plan, way forward document, in which it again stressed how important common land is, how it needs greater attention and consideration, and they hope to make proposals that are workable on common land. But it's also become very clear in the last week or so that actually there has been very little work on this. And so Welsh Government is saying that it wants to develop the evidence base with stakeholders. Well, our project is so far the only suggestions there is, the only work that's been done in that regard, even counting Welsh Government as we understand it. What's happening here? So just to outline what's going to be talked about tonight, we're going to have an introduction, which was started, of course. Then we're going to start thinking about the differences between the action-based or the prescriptive and the results-based. How they're really quite different processes with a very different pattern of activity over time. So it's not the first thing that strikes you when you hear about them. And in fact, it's probably the last thing that strikes you. And it's only something that struck me during the process of doing this project, actually. But it really is very, very different. And it has a lot of implications. Challenging, but good, I think, overall. We'll talk about the implications in particular for governance on commons, self-governance by the graziers, and we'll touch finally on where advisors and project officers might fit into that picture. So what's the aim of this element of the work? Well, the aim is to design a process which empowers graziers, and especially the active graziers, to turn these public goods and progress in going towards the results that are needed with regard to those public goods, to turn those into a private good, so products of their businesses and of their management. And that these products are things for which they are rewarded for applying their experience and their knowledge and skills. So the card has to really, really focus on that, because that's at the heart of the whole ethos of it. And that's something that happens not just one-off, in a one-off manner at the start, let's say, but it's something that happens throughout the process. So the process needs to be one which encourages that and supports it. That process also has to be flexible and involve only the minimum necessary commitment. Because one of the things we know about common land is that there's a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different rights holders. And one of the issues, of course, with a mechanism where you have to plan 5 years into the future is that you're taking a lot into assumption, really, or you're having to assume a lot, or you're having to make provision for a lot of things. So people die, people become active, people become inactive, all these kind of things you more or less know are going to happen. It's much more likely on a common grazings than it is on a farm. And you have to plan for them, and that involves, of course, making commitments for people who are not yet active, all this kind of thing, which is a real hassle. So if you can avoid that, you reduce the transaction costs really significantly. And so if we can design one that's like that, all to the better. And then finally, of course, and it goes back to the first point also, we want to complement and reinforce governance. So it's not something that makes it more difficult to run the common or to run the common well, but something potentially that makes it easier or that supports running a common well, and that builds capacity within the graziers and their collective body, the association, not just to deal with the scheme, but also to deal with these larger concepts and to integrate them better into their agronomic decisions, if we can say that, the decisions about the cattle and the sheep. And that might involve support and guidance and advice. So that's our aim. And we can think, actually, before we go on, how Glastir stacks up against that aspiration. So certainly there was some consideration of governance and reinforcement of governance in the Glastir process. In fact, the CDOs were brought in essentially to achieve a certain level of governance through the formation of associations. But the capacity that was built had a very limited focus, of course, because the scheme itself only demanded a certain limited focus of capacity. So there was no real need to develop capacity in the understanding of environmental processes and their interaction with grazing, for example. You just had to understand the rules and be able to implement them. Glastir itself did have this 5-year commitment, so it wasn't flexible at all. And in fact, Grazers Association had to think ahead how they would be flexible to respond to the lack of flexibility on Glastir's part. There was no reflection at all or adaptation. In fact, the very ethos of the scheme was the opposite, that there's a set of prescriptions and you have to obey them. And if there's any adaptation by results, to achieve better results, I should say, then that would be done on the part of government as a result of monitoring, etc. And we know that actually didn't happen that much at all. And then finally, when we think about Glastir, empowering the graziers and the active graziers, well, I think it was had very limited achievements in that regard, I would say. Certainly it did turn what government wanted into private goods to a certain extent, but they weren't results in any sense. So they weren't progress towards results, they were just obeying of rules, and it didn't very often empower the active graziers. In fact, it tended to empower the inactive graziers compared to the situation prior to that. And it didn't reward graziers for their experience or knowledge or skills. So there's a lot of things that potentially can be done better, and our challenge is to find a mechanism which does at least some of those things. Until last week, I was going to talk only about how this approach is potentially different from Glastir. But I realized last week that I should actually make the point also that it's different from BPS. That seems really obvious to any of us, I think, that are working with farmers or that are farmers. But it seems it's a point that needs to be made. So all payments in the past, which are direct payments or which are similar to direct payments, such as LFA support, that's been paid to the individual farmer directly. And only the Agri-Environment Scheme has been paid through a Graziers Association. And we know that there are some commons, quite a few commons, where it hasn't been possible to get a Graziers Association, or where Graziers Associations are rather dysfunctional. And the BPS element of payments has been insulated from that by being paid direct to farmers. And that's going to change, of course. So never before has all of the Graziers payments relating to the common come through the association. And potentially that's a huge increase in transaction costs and could involve potential impediments. That seems quite clear. That seems obvious from the very first time it was discussed. But it seems it needs to be said, which is a shame, I think. We know that there's a roughly 160,000 hectares of common land claimed for BPS. And if we think what the average level of BPS is, that must be something like £10 million annually. So it's quite a lot of money we're talking about. And it impacts maybe 3,000 claimants. Of course, they're not active, which is a concern to us. But anyway, currently it impacts about 3,000 people, we think. And so it really is worthy of attention and progress. It's worthy as attention and progress for ecological, environmental reasons, of course, and results delivery, but also because it's a fundamental part of people's businesses. And they need the same seriousness given to the commons part of it as they do the part on the farm. So it's not something that we can lump alongside landscape or collaborative aspects, which are sort of nice to have elements on top of the farm. Yeah, these are really fundamental things and they deserve attention now, I think. Okay, let's just move on from that. So let's think then about Glastir and how Glastir worked. So before applying, obviously, there needed to be a lot of thinking. So you need to ask, well, what would we have to do to if we were in the scheme? And would that thing we would have to do, those things, would they be worth it in terms of the money we'd get? Who'd get the money? That's a big question in Commons. And that's also one of the places where there's been most difficulty, of course. So do we have to give money to the inactive glaciers? Do we have to give money to the owner of the soil? All these kind of questions, they would have to be discussed at the start. And as I was just mentioning earlier, what happens when things change? Because we have to make a 5-year commitment here. So what happens if one of us dies? Or what happens if one of the inactive people die and then a new entrant comes in who wants to be active? What happens if there's climatic conditions change, or the market changes and we don't really want to be in it anymore? What penalties do we have? All these kind of things, they need to be discussed at the start, because at the start is the time to discuss them, and after that it's too late. You have a 5-year commitment. And what happened, of course, in Glastir is that there was low uptake at the start, and the government set up a network of Commons Development Officers. And those Commons Development Officers, they helped in bringing together associations as legal persons, and also give advice on this kind of thing. There was some ecological advice, I dare say, but that wasn't the focus of it. But the advisor was very important at the start. And after that start, then away you go. The best situation is if you never have to think about it again, if the 5 years go without incident and all is well. So the money comes every year, you might get an inspection, hopefully you pass it, hopefully you've got your stocking calendar right, you've got your diary, and you don't really need much advice. I think people would say, well, actually, sometimes we did need advice, but it wasn't such a common thing. And government didn't think you needed advice. So government got rid of the Commons Development Officers once uptake was high enough. So that was Glastir. And as we said before, the Graziers' reflections on what was happening and whether it was working, whether there was things that should be adjusted, they just didn't feature. That's not a part of the way the scheme works. So they just get on with it. Okay. So we're talking about something which is really quite different. It starts off, of course, quite similar. There's a period, especially for Commons, where you really have to think about things at the start. You ask the same questions. Is it worth it? Certainly. And then you could already be starting, if you have estimated your scores, you could be thinking, well, how can we improve the scores? But anyway, you'd know roughly what kind of money you'd be getting. And you'd need to have rules for sharing the money. That's quite clear. And you'd need to have that at the start. And I think it's more or less universally agreed. That's the way I would put it, from graziers, that help is needed at that point. So you need some sort of facilitation, some kind of advice, some kind of guidance, both to understand the scheme and to start in the capacity building as far as how the scheme works, and also in this more governance side of things, what kind of rules you should have to run the whole thing. But once that happens, it's really, really different. So of course you say you want to be involved in the scheme, and so at the end of the year, in the summer, the next summer, then you get scoring, and there'll be some auditing, I'm sure, in the first year anyway. And you get scores, and you get some money associated with the scores. And then it's time for discussion. Actually, it's not time for clockwork behavior. It's time for discussion again. And so you'd be asking, well, should we improve our score? How could we improve our score? And which bits of the common would give us an easy improvement of score that wouldn't cost us too much? Are there things maybe which we could ask for capital works support for? Also, of course, should we carry on? Because there's no particular commitment here. You're just talking about the year that's gone and the money and the scores you got for that, and thinking ahead another year to how you might approach it the next time. But the rules about the payments, you already set those at the start, so you're not discussing those every year unless you find they're somehow deficient. And that happens every year. You may want advice. I think probably in the first year, the second year, you're still in that capacity building process, but maybe you come to a time where you don't need an advisor. But either way, you go through this process every year because it's part of your business decision making. You have options. That's the whole essence of a results-based approach. You have options. There's certain payments associated with those options, and you can work out the costs, and you decide what is best to do. So are you in one year having a lot better return for your animals? So, okay, you don't want to bother so much with the results-based payment, or another year, are you having really poor results with the animals, want to do more, or whatever rationale you have in mind, that's entirely up to you. But this is the essence of it, that you go every year and you think, and you respond, just as you think and respond about everything else that applies to your business on the animal side of things. So that's really, really, really different to the prescriptive action-based approach. So just to go through that again to a certain extent, if you're an individual, then in principle, all you need is to express interest in the scheme. So those of you who have been to Ireland, and I still hope to take a trip over to Ireland at some point, but those who've been to Ireland know that the way the schemes work there is you have an expression of interest form, and it's just one sheet. It's just your name and your CRN and your address or whatever, and that's it. Nothing happens at that point. You're effectively asking for an appointment to have a score done. But for grazings, of course, as we just said, it's different. You do have to think ahead. You have to think about the cost of the thing compared to the income from the thing. Is it worth the bother of doing it when it's so complicated on the grazings? If you do decide to do it, how will decisions be made? How will decisions about money be made? Will there be allocation for a rainy day or for administration? You need to decide all that at the start, really. And as those of you who are at the second of these seminars, the one about payment rationales, as we discussed then a bit, we should be designing that sort of mindset into the scorecards and especially into the payment rationales. So the payment rationales should be telling you, well, this is what the payments are for, and these are the people, therefore, who are deserving of the payments. But we also need, I think, guidelines from government on what's fair and what can be felt as unfair. So if the owner of the soil doesn't want to take part because the contribution he's getting isn't the amount that he wants. Well, it should be free for government to say, well, if there's no costs incurred by the owner of the soil, he shouldn't get any money. And we're not going to entertain an appeal from that person if he's not incurring costs, that kind of thing. And by the same token, if there was an internal agreement between graziers and it doesn't have provision for new entrants to come in, well, that's unfair. And it should be a grounds for appeal that government would support. In other words, that you have some sort of framework of how government will look at these things. I mean, perhaps even that the government should assume that everybody will be in the scheme unless there's some reason for them not to be in the scheme. All these kind of things can really help graziers and help the governance, the self-governance, and to support the active amongst the graziers without creating a closed shop of the currently active, which is very important. It seems unanimous, I would say, that people think that at least at that start, you need independent expert assistance. So it's a really high priority. And I would say that it's really important also that that's at zero cost. And that zero cost isn't paid only if you go into the scheme. Because it's quite a valid decision, I think, not to go into the scheme. But government needs to have Grazing Association go through this thinking process. It doesn't want to have them, deterred from going into the process because they think they will have to find some money if they don't go in. Yeah. And just to note again, there's no need for a substantive commitment to the government. If the government gives you a substantive commitment, of course, that's different. That's really helpful. No substantive commitment, and nor a substantive internal commitment between the graziers apart from the way they will administer the money. Now, you might think that that's really not helpful, that people want to give a commitment, but the experience from Ireland is the opposite, actually. So in Ireland, in these results-based EIPs, there's no need for a commitment, but the commitment is there from the government that there'll be 5 years of support. And what that's resulted in is higher levels of uptake of the scheme than of the National Agri-Environment Scheme, and at the same time, lower levels of leaving the scheme than the national scheme. And so, although it looks like a high-risk thing for government, in fact, the results, if we're thinking about results, it's supposed to be a results-based approach, the results actually are better. And so that's something very much to think about. And then, to repeat what I was saying earlier, every year, you're looking at something like this, aren't you? You're looking at not somebody at the desk, just doing the claims and just signing the checks. You're looking at going out into the field and thinking about things, thinking about what the signals are, thinking about how things could be done better, potentially, how things could be done more profitably, certainly. So looking over the scores in detail and seeing where change is possible. And where change is possible, do a cost-benefit analysis. So it may be that there's no capital works for that thing, but it might still be worth doing. For example, I think I gave an example in the stakeholders meeting of an area on a common that had some Sitka growing onto it. And it might be worth the graziers just cutting the Sitka, the self-seeded Sitka, without any capital work support, if the incentive was high enough, because then you'd get that payment going forward. Yeah, but you might have capital support, and you might also be considering whether it's worth asking for that. Every year there would be annual training, but then every year you'd consider whether you wanted to carry on in the scheme by the same token, because there's no commitment, and of course you share the money out. So that implies, to me, 2 levels of trained people. On the one side, there's those who run the program. So that's a small number that's needed. Potentially, I would say probably ideally, they would be involved in the design of the measure and in continual reflection of the measure in an evaluation sort of process. Not just them, of course, but they would be involved in that. So these would be the people who would raise awareness initially, who would hold information meetings and that kind of thing. They would be the people who would train advisors for the pre-participation phase. So you would need a set of advisors that were something like CDOs, but with more of an ecological knowledge base within that group at least. They would be the people who would be training advisors and farmers annually. They wouldn't be doing all the scores, but they would be auditing the scores, because clearly there's a need for an auditing process and to ensure that the quality of the scores coming in are adequate. They would process the scores and they would generate the payments, and they would also approve requests for capital works. And in the case of Ireland, actually, another thing they do, which is associated with that, is paperwork that things that would equate to our PDOs. Actually, they would help with getting the permissions for that, and even perhaps things which could equate to some of the Commons Act things about capital works. So, for example, in Gelligar, in the Rhymney Valley, the project officers there and the council has itself been putting out notices for capital works on the common. So this is equally the kind of thing that the project officers could do, I think. Excuse me. The project officers would run any complementary contracts. So those could be any sorts of things, including monitoring, but they could be other things as well. And they would liaise with government institutions. So you need a group that's the guardians of the soul of the program, if you want to put it that way. Yeah, so they're the ones that keep the program, they keep it real, but they keep it meaningful. They make sure everybody else's capacity is at the level that it needs to be, and they in turn answer to government in some way. And then below that, you have another level of trained people. So these are the ones that initially help with the governance issues. So like the CDO equivalent, you could say. They're the ones that explain the scheme at the start. They're the ones that help to raise capacity for the graziers to score and to respond to the scores. So to say, for example, oh, well, don't just look at the score of 3 where it's really hard to increase the score. Why don't you look at the score of 7 where you can increase the score by 1 or something, that kind of thing. And these things are things that are clearly needed at the start, but the need for which might tail off as the thing goes on and as the capacity of graziers is raised. And then there's other things which are specialized. So we talked about, I think it was in the first of the webinars, we talked about things like fire management plans, or animal health and biosecurity plans, or perhaps peatland restoration plans, or archaeological, monuments safeguarding plans, or whatever. So these need specialist input from the vets, from the fire service, etc. So that's maybe a slightly different class of things that you need help with. But most of those things, I think, on an ongoing basis can vary a lot. So as farmers get more competent, more confident, then they might decide to do everything. I don't see why not. Everything that doesn't need a professional, like a vet, for example. As we know, just like in Gloucester, in some places, maybe they farm the admin out, and maybe the farmers will do the score, or maybe they farm out the scoring and they do the admin. And there's all sorts of things which are possible. And of course, as Les said on the video, maybe graziers don't want somebody on their shoulder. Maybe they just want a phone number they can call for some support and advice. So all these possibilities are there, and everything in between. And all we would say is that I think whoever does the scoring officially, that provides the scores officially, has to have training, annual training. But I don't see why it can't be a farmer or somebody that the graziers appoint, just as much as a project officer or an advisor or somebody that's traditionally been an advisor. And we're not being prescriptive about that in our proposal. We're just saying that we want to build transaction costs into payments, so the associations can just decide whatever suits them. They can keep it in-house, they can farm it out, that's fine. There's transaction costs, and we should recognize them. So this is, to some extent, the approach that's taken in Ireland and which works quite well there. So the biggest of the results-based programs in Ireland is the Hen Harrier project. So it currently has 1,600 participants, covering 40,000 hectares with 25,000 parcels of land. So that's a mixture of farms and jointly owned commonages. Most of the parcels, of course, will be private farmland, and you can imagine that they'll be very small, some of them, to get that number of total parcels. But that whole project is managed by a team of 7. And that's, I should say also, that's in geographically separate SPAs, spreading across almost the whole length of the country. That's run by 7, as I say, and only full-time, only 5 of those are full-time. And in the Irish way of doing things, then below that, there's 100 advisors. And they reckon that they could manage with 40, really, if they were fully focused on this kind of work. So that's about 40 participants per advisor. But if you remember from other talks, in Ireland, you have to have an advisor. You have to use an advisor. It's the tradition they have. But we don't think that should be the case. You should be able to choose to have an advisor or choose not to have an advisor, or to choose to use an advisor whenever you wanted. That's sometimes and not at other times. And so that would surely reduce the number that you'd need in Wales to allow farmers, if you allowed farmers to do it. Having said that, mind you, I was an advisor in Scotland on agri-environment and other things for 15 years. And what we found there was that, in general, farmers, in a scheme that was quite complicated and was treating with things which they weren't familiar with, they liked the insurance and the expertise and the objectivity, and potentially a voice with the department, of course, which an advisor gave them. So it's not quite like that, of course. The results-based approach is not this adversarial thing which sometimes can develop with prescriptive schemes. But still, I can imagine that would be true for some commons anyway. And we can compare that to the experience in Wales with the CDOs, of course. So about 200 commons entered last year, and a team of about 18 CDOs was involved in that. But then there was some, of course, desk officers also. So yeah, it gives us a feel for the kind of scale of things, and I would say that the scale sounds sort of similar, really. So if we're thinking that those commons would cover 160,000 hectares, let's say, yeah, it sounds about right. That's the kind of level we're talking about at this top level. And if you think about it, this Irish split way of doing it is quite efficient in terms of staff time. So the project team is very small, and it can be busy the whole year then. In the summer, it's doing auditing scores and doing some monitoring evaluation. And in the winter, it's processing payments, processing capital works requests, training advisors, training farmers, etc. Pre-participation, they would be involved, of course, in publicity and developing systems and all that. Whereas with advisors, as I say, the summer period, of course, would be busy if you used an advisor. But my suspicion is that the use of advisors would fall to a plateau as time went on. And so you'd have to think about how to cope with that at the start, of course. So what do we think of this different way of doing things? Is it just a pain in the neck, or is it a huge opportunity? Well, I think we have to think back to Welsh Government's objectives here. So it wants to deliver better results in terms of policy objectives, but it also actually, it wants to, it says in other places, it wants to engage farmers' skills and experience and to make it into a reactive, a dynamic way of doing things. And I would say you can't achieve those things unless you have a process of continuous reflection. It's more It takes more time and effort. It certainly does. Maybe certainly on the part of farmers, because farmers have to think about how they react to things. But then they also have to think about how they react to the market, the prices of inputs, and we don't think that's a bad thing. We think that's an essential element in getting effectiveness, efficiency, and cost benefits. If we want delivery of public goods to be a core business consideration, what other alternative is there really? I think we can see what the alternative in practice is, in the way that a lot of people think about cluster and talk about cluster, that it's something that they work around, or of course doesn't fit at all and they don't engage with. So it's the complete opposite of internalizing public policy objectives in the way that the government wants to happen. These are the words of Leslie Griffiths in the foreword, I think, to Brexit No Land, to one of the documents anyway. Drawing on the skills and knowledge already within the farming community. Well, how are you going to do that if you just set rules and they don't need to think about things? You don't want them to think about things. Thinking about things is unhelpful and potentially depressing for them. And what we see in Ireland is that there's a huge difference actually caused by these schemes, this approach, in terms of mindset. There's a much higher level of engagement. There's a degree of bringing skills to bear, which was never the case in the old reps and glass in Ireland. And there's a factor, a pride in a new project, in a new product. It's something that they produce as well as producing a good calf or a good lamb. As I said before in one of the meetings, if you ask for somebody to come and talk to you about the projects in Ireland, you don't get a project officer, you get a farmer now. That's how engaged they are with the whole approach. But it needs action, I think, to get it to happen, even as part of a wider package. It needs more work than we've been able to do in this 13 months. So we know that government is aware that leaving Commons until last has been a mistake. In Glasgow, they needed to respond to that by having a team of CDOs. But it really looks like that's what's happening again, that Commons are being left to last. So I was looking at I asked Google what sayings there were about this kind of thing, and they amounted to this, a lot of them. That if you repeat a mistake time and again, then it becomes a choice actually, or in the case of government, it becomes part of your policy to do that. And that seems really, really, really strange when Commons are such a large area of the semi-natural land of Wales, and of the triple size of Wales, on the semi-natural vegetation of Wales, the peatlands of Wales, and so on. We know that there's uncertainty about budgets. We're very, very aware of that, and it's not Welsh Government's fault. But there's lots of questions about how things would work in common land, and moves can be made as far as developing solutions, which can be done even when the budget available is tiny. I don't think a lack of budget is a reason not to make a move, I think, to try and think about things, even if the things turn out to be dead ends. That's quite possible. I think we have to sympathise a lot with government. It wants to have change. It also says now that it wants to support the good things that are there, but it wants to manage risk, and that's very, very understandable. And the risk, of course, is all the more when we're only talking about one measure basket into which all the eggs are being put. But we would say that the way to respond to that is to use the time. Don't waste any more time. Break the problem down into manageable chunks. Try things out. Make the mistakes in the safe space of a pilot. And to treat civil society, even this project, as an ally. We're meant to be achieving the policy objectives of us as the Welsh citizenry. And so there's an opportunity here, but an opportunity that's very easily lost, I think. So I think that's a good place to end the last of these webinars. we really hope that things will move, and we really hope we contribute to that. We know that there's issues to be discussed. We know there's issues that are not fully covered yet, not fully thought through yet. But now is the time, I think. In 2 years' time, it'll be too late. So thanks very much. If there are questions, we can have that. But in the meantime, all of these videos, the 4 webinars, at least after I've put them up, will be on the EFNCP YouTube channel, as well as the stakeholder meeting from last week. So I'll stop my sharing there and see if there's any questions. Okay, there's a question from Glenda here in the chat. So Glasgow Common covers any shared grazings, not just common land. Are you considering common land only within your project? No, we're considering we're considering solutions that we think will work on common land, with the intention that they would also work on a private mountain, for example, and I would hope also would work on shared grazing. But if Glenda has some ideas of aspects which she thinks are particularly difficult, that would be interesting to hear about. But we're not going to respond to them in this last 2 weeks of the project. But they would be very interesting to hear about, actually. I mean, by all means, switch your mic on, Glenda, and tell us what some of them are.
Hello, Gwen, am I?
Hi, Glenda.
No, I was just trying to think through it, because any mountain that was shared grazing had to go into Glasgow Common and Glasgow Common land. And then I'm just thinking, very often the common land can be Crown Estate or something like this, but sometimes you've got landowners who are quite active in, they've got gamekeepers employed by them who are burning, predator control, cutting, and also, very importantly, are there on the mountain to reduce the fire risk, in my opinion. And so I just think the sort of consideration about if there's an active owner of the common or somebody who wants to get involved, then maybe that should be given a bit more consideration in that, in the sort of the move towards partnership and collaboration, cooperation with everybody, isn't it?
No, I would agree with that completely. I think, well, I think you need to be thinking long term, wouldn't you? You wouldn't want at the start to be thinking, okay, I'll just think about what the law requires and what this year requires. You need to be thinking, well, what if in 3 years' time I want to be doing something that isn't necessarily covered by my rights of common, or indeed, as you say, if already the owner of the soil is doing works there which are in support of these public good delivery and which are costs and which may also be covered through the thing. I know I completely agree. It needs to be, yeah, you need to think ahead, but without what I would want to avoid is the necessity to pay out money to people who weren't incurring costs. So if the people incurring costs include the owner of the soil, I have no problem with that at all.
Yeah, so many different situations around, aren't there? There
are. So David Jarrett says, Glenda. David Jarrett says, no, you have met with Welsh Government. Are you giving their decision makers a formal presentation? Yeah, we did meet with some Welsh Government staff last week. We met them before, but we met them last week in this final period. I hope we will. The offer is there. We are supposed to be meeting at some point with certain more senior staff, but the ball is to some extent in their court, David. And if you think that they can be chivied along, if you think it would benefit them to hear from us, then by all means put in your pennyworth. Birig says, B-League asks, I should say, how would scoring work on commons with SSI? Well, I would say that that's the wrong question, actually, because I don't think there's any issue with scoring on SSI. The issue is more how to respond to the score on SSI. And that is a big challenge, I think. So just to cover the scoring bit first. So the scoring mechanism has been designed with, for example, condition scoring criteria from the SSE management plans included, and the guidance from Glasssteer, which was produced with CCW, I suppose it would have been at that point, input. So the scoring would be the same, really. And one of the things we would very much like to investigate, I think, in the next few months, is to what extent in detail that scoring would reflect what NRW officers would want the message to be on different places. That's something that's well worth considering, I think, because if the card doesn't work for NRW, who is the government's conservation advisor and its flood management advisor and so forth, then it doesn't work. But to go back to my original point, the question for me is more how to respond to the card. So the graziers can choose not to do anything in response to the card, or they might choose to vary their grazing, to vary their other management practices, or as Glenda says, that the owner of the soil might change their management practices. There might be management practices brought in or suggested in the fire management plan, whatever. And so how do you get a rapid turnaround, a rapid discussion of that kind of thing with the local NRW staff would be more my question, really. If that potentially is happening every year, potentially it's a good thing, of course. But yes, it has personnel implications maybe for NRW, and it certainly has an implication for turnaround. You know, slow turnarounds of decisions would be, well, it would make things difficult, especially if the slowness was more than a management season, let's say, and because it would in effect make it impossible to respond, wouldn't it? So these are important questions, I think. As I say, in Ireland, if the graziers or the land manager, the farmer, whatever, wants to do something which is a potential PDO equivalent in Ireland, then the project staff are involved actively in engaging with MPWS or the county council or whoever it is who's the competent authority on that particular matter. So it is a question that's worth asking. Good one. Have you, Sarah Woodcock asks, have you considered a Section 16 agreement from NRW as a payment option complement to the scheme payments, as they can be used to support both SSI and non-SSI sites? Well, we're not, we haven't, how can I say it? We haven't constrained ourselves to any particular measure. The only thing that's constrained us is the WTO rules on what payments can be based on. So income forgone, additional costs in the case of agri-environment. So we're not saying that this is just applicable to SFS. It could be used to run NRW management schemes on places that don't have SFS, if that's possible. And there's all sorts of ways you could imagine things fitting together, isn't there, in this wider toolbox. So it may be that there's some capital works which are not made available for some reason by Welsh Government, which NRW might think are appropriate. All sorts of possibilities are possible, I think. So Helen Barnes asks, is the Irish government taking the payment by results approach forward on a broader basis than individual pilots? Well, I was in a meeting with my Irish colleagues earlier today, and yes, they are. That's the intention. Just now, the new CAP is being designed in Ireland, So there's been a number of us trying to help in that process. And the proposal is that this kind of approach will be made. So just now, I should say that this approach is being used in roughly 3,000 different contracts, 3,000 participants. And so there's discussion, a serious discussion, proposal actually, that government has that would make it available to, at a minimum, 20,000, possibly 30 or more thousand farmers. So yeah, they are, yeah. And that would have, for those that are interested in policy minutiae, that would be done, as far as the farmers are concerned, as a single scheme, but in fact would be, behind the scenes, would be run under 3 measures. So the area payments, the kind that we've been discussing, would be run under the agri-environment measure. Then there'd be non-productive investments measure to complement it. And then the project team would be a cooperation measure instrument. Yeah, so run as a cooperation program. But as I say, to the farmer, it would look like a seamless garment, but that's how the different things would be funded. Anybody else? Oh, there we are. Okay, well, that's, yeah, not a question, but that's, yeah, noted. Yeah, I think realistic, as a general point, I think realistic payment levels are essential, really. I think this mindset that the farmer should contribute to some percentage to a what's the word, a non-profit making enterprise, a non-profit making action is really, it's immoral in my opinion. But having said that, in Ireland, the approach that they take on the capital works is that there's a variable scale. So if the capital works is any way of material use to the farmer and his operation, so for example, it might be water troughs or water supply, or maybe even a track, then the farmer contributes a certain percentage, and that percentage gets less and less as the value to the farmer's business gets less and less. So that's a potentially positive thing you could do. So it tends to, it makes farmers think twice about whether the capital works make sense, and of course, especially if it's capital works where their own labour is being paid for, which is what we propose actually. So instead of having 100% cost and then you just propose as much as you can, then in Ireland they have a percentage, and then they also have a maximum amount of capital works that's available, I think, per hectare usually. It might be as a percentage of payments, I can't remember, but yeah, so there's some limit also, so that the scale of the area payment and the incentive that comes that way is always bigger than the capital works. Dim problem. Diolch, David. So Helen Barnes asks again, how is this approach being viewed in Scotland and other countries? Yeah, well, I am involved to some extent in Scotland. In Scotland, there's been a lot more public thinking than in Wales, but the amount of concrete measure development has been quite low so far, to the extent actually that some of the unions are making noises to say that it needs to speed up a bit. But as part of the overall government thinking, there's been some payment by outcomes pre-pilots, I think that's the way to say it. So far, no money has changed hands between government and farmer. So they've been interesting and successful as it goes so far, but they need further development, I would say. In other countries, are you asking a big question there now? So there's a European results-based payment network. which, yeah, I can't find the, if Helen wants to find the URL and put it in the chat, she can do that. So you'll see that there's lots of interest in it. There's lots of interest in the Commission. There's lots of interest in various member states. There have been schemes implemented. There are schemes implemented in various different member states, and there's partial inventory also there on the results-based payments page on DG Environment's website. So some of the earliest schemes have been schemes for species risk grasslands. The most, well, there's a fairly large scheme in Germany for grasslands. There's a suite of schemes in Austria with some, very active colleagues of ours involved in those. And there's some quite innovative ones related to predators in Sweden and Finland. So there is a range of such measures. But I should be honest here and say, of course, they don't cover everything. They're not like this replacement for SFS. They're a small part of agri-environment even, let alone a small part of CAP payments as a whole. So that is really it's a different bird in Wales, really. That makes it all the more challenging, of course. Okay. Right, David Jarrett, enjoy your lamb chops. Speak to you again. Okay, so Helen's put the European-wide results-based network URL in the chat there. So you can go to it without joining it, but you can join it and get updated messages from them, whatever. Yeah, well worth doing, I would say. Okay, well, let's bring it to an end there. So thanks very much to everybody that's joined us over the past 4 weeks, or that's just joined us tonight, actually. I hope you think it's been worth doing. I think we think it has been. So this stuff will be repeated on paper with more added, I'm sure, in the report, and that will come out in a couple of weeks' time. But meanwhile, if any of you are involved in things and you want us to come and speak to you or yeah, discuss things with you, then we're very, very willing to do it even after the project has ended. So I should maybe thank the funders again, and thanks my colleagues in the team. And once again, thank you for coming. So thanks very much. Right.